Good night. Good evening, colleagues. My name is Raciel Gutierrez Morales. I am from Mexico, from the state of Michoacan, from the 18th section. To not be too long, I'm going to read this document that we have as a report, and if there was a bit more time, I would add some other information. I just want to have this be read out and that you all get to know it. So in the issue of the education reform, so we want to, the bilateral negotiations are to break the collective bargaining, and we act erroneously against this so-called education reform, and new rules try to impose rules against collective bargaining. These policies have generated precariousness around work and social exclusion as a result of these reforms that exploit labor, and these are processes with a long history, and they correspond to the global processes of restructuring in which speculative financial capital predominates, which has three components relating to the relationship between labor and work: labor and capital, employment, salaries, and labor rights. This includes the flexibilization and impoverishment of workers, of the loss of Social Security, the substitution of work by technologization, and the breaking of constitutional rights. Another is the loss of wages due to inflation. There's also the issue of repression and authoritarianism, but this has not stopped popular struggles. In the last couple of years, the population in the country have seen their human rights abused, such as the right to freedom of assembly, to freedom of expression, to protest, and even to nonpartisan political organizing. This through different avenues, most of them legal, which have infringed against the Mexican Constitution and the values of the Mexican Revolution. For example, the Atenco law, which permits police groups to use live firearms against demonstrators, and other mechanisms such as recognizing a strike as a form of struggle. Governments and private agencies have promoted agreements between private security firms and other institutions, and to use the servile mass media in order to stigmatize popular protest. That despite that, social organizing is a right and is something that we used to fight for just causes. The struggles carried out by democratic unions and organizations, the CNTE is one of the principal actors defending public education for several years now, and they are one of the principal pillars of public education in our country. This history comes from more than 36 years of struggle, and it was begun by the demands of a democratic teachers union. We are now confronting this critical phase of struggling against the approval of this so-called education reform, and this critical phase is the so-called evaluation of teachers. So in this sense, as educational workers, we have been suffering an infinite amount of repressions, and we are in very complicated space because practically all of the media is on the side of the state. We have no way of expressing ourselves to the general society in a mass way. We have no space in the media. In order to explain the real reasons for the struggles that we maintain in the National Coordination of Educators, we have a big challenge as repression keeps on being a part of the arm of the state to impose this educational reform, and this in many different parts has generated different reactions by parts of different colleagues in different states where there had previously not been a struggle. And this gives us the opportunity so that in a not so distant future we can declare that the education reform can be defeated. But also in this sense, not only the coordination in defense of public education has been playing a role, but also the parents of students have been playing an important role in this struggle. Because through the approval of this education reform, the National Coordination of Educational Workers has been developing a broad work with parents of students who are our principal immediate allies to inform them about the dangers of this reform. And it's not an issue only for education workers, but it's also something that has to do with the defense of a universal social right, such as education. And in this sense as well, the Article 73, paragraph 25 of the Constitution is going to be changed, which is going to offload economic costs for the maintenance of institutions towards parents. So this has allowed parents to generate a critical consciousness so that they can see the implications and consequences of this education reform. This has also permitted that the parents of students, together with their sons and daughters who are in higher education, in post-secondary, secondary, middle school and middle school, can also organize to defend public education. These experiences of defending public education, we carry this out in different states throughout the Mexican Republic. One of the fruits of this work of disseminating the consequences of this law in Mexico City, that the parents of students, to defend their public education, they started to support the students by closing down the schools, but then because they started to get the cost of lighting and electricity, and this was one of the first consequences, that the parents of students would have to start paying for electricity costs, and it was around 50,000 pesos. So this is where there was some disappointment amongst the parents of students. Also within the student body, there have been meetings, there's been organizing work, not only by education workers, but also through different contexts, through Through different situations, university students themselves have begun to mobilize because they have realized that public education is at risk. So also their rights are being abused. And in this sense, we are starting to coordinate our work of defending public education against privatization, because in our countries they're trying to impose neoliberal mega projects, and we believe that education also is a mega project because it's seen as a commodity which can be sold. So this is an important issue which we think people should be made aware of. The student movement at the Polytechnic Institute of Students against the in defense of public education, there many alumni from this school which saw their philosophy of putting science and technology in the service of the public at risk, because they want to use science and technology to promote democracy, equality, and this is what they said in their organic declaration. They worry about the flexibilization that will allow private enterprise to use their facilities and the disappearance of collegial institutions They also want to restrict the places for students, and they want to criminalize dissent within the Polytechnic community. These efforts have been developed for a while now, and it is now giving its first fruits, and the students are also very much engaged in defending public education, and we as the National Coordinator of Education Workers, from the 15th we are going to realize our indefinite strike, and hopefully you will also be supporting, and in the student body as well. We consider that the defense of public education is not only a responsibility of education workers, but also of the broader public. In terms of the limitations and struggles of teachers' mobilizations in Mexico, there are currently protests to respect the social, labor, and human rights of workers and of the people in general in many regions of the country, but very few of them are only starting to have some successes, such as on last May 1st, where we were able to join forces with different labor organizations and social and popular organizations, both in the countryside and in the city, for a mass demonstration. One of the larger challenges which we think is important is collective action, to which we are taking small steps towards with a common agenda of struggle of education workers, both in higher education, secondary and middle school, acting in an articulate way to reject the punitive education reform, to exiting the crisis from the perspective of education workers has to include massive strikes against the use of public funds to subsidize private industry and the privatization of public institutions which have been handed over to private corporations, state control of mass media and telecommunications. And More concretely, we have this plan of action that in defense of public education, we want a rejection of these teachers' evaluation, of these standardized teachers' evaluations, privatizations, and this punitive reform, which the exclusion of education from the free trade agreements and an end to austerity and budget cuts to social services. A dignified working salary and pension for teachers. There are many teachers who have not been paid since January because they've been defending public education, or because they have resisted being evaluated, because even though there's a huge campaign right now for teachers to be evaluated, many of us, knowing the implications of this evaluation, have not participated, and therefore as punishment their pay has been suspended. But also the state has not been able to complete its evaluation in different states. For example, as the four pillars of the national coordination of the National Coordinator of Workers, Teachers, and there has been repression against the section in Oaxaca because currently we have six teachers who are political prisoners for defending education. In the state of Michoacan as well, we had 22 student teachers who were incarcerated, but thanks to our strength, to the strength of not only education workers but also of public sector workers and different social and popular organizations, they were able to the state freed these students. Well, and these are some actions that have been committed against all of those who try and defend public education. Well, there's a lot to say, but I think that I'm running out of time here, so thanks.